They were prepared for hunger, cold floors, and sleepless nights filled with fear, because that was what captivity meant in their minds. Instead, German prisoners of war arriving in America were led into quiet barracks with real beds, clean blankets, and a silence so unfamiliar that it felt more disturbing than any shouting guard. For men who had marched across burning cities and frozen battlefields, this calm was not mercy, but a psychological shock that made them question where they truly were and what captivity was supposed to be. For German prisoners of war, captivity had always been imagined as a descent into noise, deprivation, and constant humiliation, a place where sleep would be interrupted, rest would be denied, and exhaustion would be used as another weapon. From a moment of capture, many expected nights spent on hard ground, crowded rooms filled with shouting, and an atmosphere designed to break the spirit as much as the body. What they encountered in American prison camps challenged that expectation in a far more unsettling way. Instead of chaos, there was order. Instead of constant commands, there was routine. And instead of sleepless fear, there were structured nights governed by lights-out schedules, assigned sleeping spaces, and an unfamiliar quiet that settled over the barracks after dark. The presence of real beds was the first shock. Metal frames aligned in rows, mattresses raised from the floor, and blankets folded with military precision did not match the image of enemy captivity that many prisoners carried with them. For soldiers who had spent months sleeping in trenches, ruined buildings, or overcrowded transport wagons, the simple act of lying down in silence felt disorienting rather than comforting. This quiet carried psychological weight. Without shouting guards or sudden alarms, the mind was left alone with memory and uncertainty. Sleep came, but it was often restless, shaped by the strange contrast between physical comfort and the reality of imprisonment. The absence of noise removed distraction, allowing thoughts to surface that had been buried by the urgency of survival on the battlefield. American camp administrators understood the power of routine. Nights were meant to be predictable, not as an act of kindness, but as part of a system designed to maintain control through stability. Lights were turned off at the same time each evening, and silence was enforced not through fear, but through structure. Guards remained present, yet distant, reinforcing order without constant confrontation. For many German POWs, this environment created confusion. Comfort was expected to bring relief, yet it often intensified awareness of captivity. Lying awake beneath clean blankets, listening to the stillness of the barracks, prisoners were confronted with a reality that felt almost unreal. This was not the captivity they had prepared themselves to endure. As days turned into nights, and nights into routine, the silence itself became part of the experience of imprisonment. It was within this calm, controlled environment that German prisoners began to understand that American captivity operated on a different psychological level, one that relied less on hardship and more on the quiet pressure of order, predictability, and time. For German prisoners of war, the journey into captivity did not end with capture on the battlefield. It continued across oceans and rail lines, carrying them farther from the familiar geography of Europe and deeper into uncertainty. Many arrived in the United States after weeks of transport, physically exhausted and mentally prepared for an experience shaped by fear, punishment, and constant hostility. The first sight of an American prison camp often felt anticlimactic. Instead of ruins or makeshift enclosures, prisoners encountered orderly compounds with wooden barracks, fenced perimeters, and clearly marked paths. Guards moved with routine efficiency, issuing instructions without shouting, guiding groups toward designated areas rather than forcing them forward. This calm organization conflicted sharply with expectations formed by wartime propaganda and battlefield experience. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed methodically. Personal items were recorded, medical checks were conducted, and basic information was collected. The procedure felt administrative rather than aggressive, reinforcing the impression that captivity here followed rules rather than impulse. For men accustomed to chaos and sudden violence, this controlled environment created unease rather than reassurance. As evening approached, prisoners were escorted to their assigned barracks. Inside, rows of metal-framed beds filled the space, each fitted with a mattress and neatly folded blankets. The room was functional and clean, illuminated by overhead lighting that cast an even glow across the floor. There was no crowding, no scramble for space, and no immediate sense of threat. For many, this scene felt surreal. The realization that each man had an assigned bed marked a significant psychological shift. In combat and retreat, sleep had been irregular and opportunistic, stolen whenever possible under harsh conditions. Here, rest was scheduled and structured, transforming sleep from a survival tactic into a regulated activity. This change disrupted deeply ingrained habits shaped by months or years of war. As lights out approached, prisoners observed the routines of the camp. Guards performed checks quietly, ensuring order without intimidation. Instructions were brief and consistent, emphasizing compliance through predictability rather than force. When the lights were finally turned off, the barracks settled into a silence that many found more unsettling than noise. Lying on real beds beneath clean blankets, prisoners confronted the strangeness of their situation. Physical comfort did not erase captivity, but it altered how captivity was experienced. Without immediate discomfort to focus on, thoughts drifted toward memory, loss, and uncertainty about the future. The quiet offered no distraction from these reflections. Sleep came unevenly. Some men fell asleep quickly, overwhelmed by exhaustion, while others lay awake, listening to the sounds of breathing and distant footsteps outside the barracks. The absence of chaos allowed the mind to wander, replaying moments of capture and imagining what lay ahead. This mental space, created by calm surroundings, proved challenging for those who had relied on constant movement and danger to suppress reflection. The first night in an American camp thus became a defining moment. It signaled that captivity here would not be marked by constant hardship, but by controlled routine and sustained order. This realization carried both relief and discomfort as prisoners began to understand that endurance would be measured not by surviving extremes, but by adapting to a system designed to persist. By morning, the barracks would come alive with scheduled activity, reinforcing the pattern established on that first night. Yet it was in the quiet hours after lights out that many German POWs first sensed that American captivity would test them in ways they had not anticipated, through normalcy rather than deprivation. As days passed inside American prison camps, German prisoners of war began to understand that sleep was not treated as a privilege, nor as a tool of punishment, but as a regulated part of daily life. Nights followed a fixed structure, one that remained consistent regardless of weather, mood, or individual circumstance. This predictability shaped how prisoners experienced both rest and captivity itself. Each evening followed the same sequence. Work details ended, evening meals were distributed, and prisoners were given time to return to their barracks. There was no rushing and no sense of urgency, only the steady movement of men following a schedule that rarely changed. The absence of unpredictability removed tension, but also emphasized how thoroughly daily life was controlled. Inside the barracks, order was maintained through simple rules rather than constant supervision. Beds were to remain aligned, personal areas kept tidy, and noise reduced after lights out. These expectations were enforced quietly, often through reminders rather than punishment. Over time, prisoners adapted to this structure, adjusting their behavior to avoid drawing attention and to preserve a sense of internal stability. Lights out marked a clear transition. When the barracks lights were switched off, conversation faded quickly, replaced by the soft sounds of movement and breathing. Guards conducted checks at regular intervals, but their presence remained distant. There were no sudden interruptions, no shouted commands, and no deliberate attempts to disrupt sleep. The camp settled into a controlled stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos many prisoners had known during combat. For some prisoners, this discipline of rest felt unnatural. War had trained them to sleep lightly, alert to danger, prepared to wake instantly. In the camp, such vigilance had no immediate purpose. The enforced calm created space for thoughts that had long been suppressed by necessity. Memories of home, battlefield losses, and unanswered questions about the future surfaced more easily in the quiet. Others found the routine comforting. Regular sleep restored physical strength and reduced exhaustion, making days more manageable. Yet even for those who benefited from rest, the realization remained that this structure was not accidental. Order served a function, shaping behavior and minimizing resistance without the need for force. American camp administrators recognized that fatigue bred unrest. By ensuring prisoners were rested, they reduced tension and maintained stability. Sleep became part of a broader system of control, one that relied on consistency rather than coercion. The absence of hardship in this area did not weaken authority. It reinforced it by creating an environment where compliance felt natural. As nights repeated this pattern, prisoners internalized the schedule. Bodies adjusted to the rhythm of the camp, waking and resting at designated times. This adaptation blurred the boundary between choice and obedience. Rest, once a personal struggle during war, had become a managed experience dictated by external rules. The quiet nights also altered relationships among prisoners. Without constant stress, interactions softened. Conversations became quieter, movements more deliberate. The shared experience of orderly rest created a subtle sense of collective adaptation, as men adjusted together to a form of captivity that demanded patience rather than endurance of suffering. By the end of the second week, the routine of sleep had become ingrained. Lights out no longer felt surprising, and silence no longer felt threatening. Yet beneath this adjustment lay an awareness that the system was designed to last. The discipline of rest was not temporary relief, but a component of long-term confinement. Through regulated nights and controlled calm, German prisoners of war began to understand that American captivity sought to shape behavior quietly. Sleep was no longer stolen or denied. It was organized, monitored, and repeated, reinforcing a reality in which endurance depended not on resisting hardship, but on living within an unchanging structure. As the routine of nights became familiar, German prisoners of war began to notice that the most difficult part of rest inside American camps was not the bed or the blanket, but the silence that followed lights out. This silence was not accidental, nor was it empty. It was structured, consistent, and deeply unsettling for men whose lives have been shaped by constant noise, urgency, and alertness. In combat zones, silence often signaled danger. It preceded artillery fire, ambushes, or sudden movement. Soldiers learned to distrust it, to remain tense when the world grew quiet. Inside the camp, silence had a different meaning. It arrived on schedule, remained steady through the night, and was enforced without visible threat. This predictability stripped silence of its warning function, leaving it psychologically exposed. Lying awake in orderly barracks, prisoners found themselves alone with their thoughts in ways they had not experienced during the war. On the front lines, exhaustion and chaos limited reflection. Survival demanded focus on immediate tasks. In captivity, physical comfort removed those distractions, allowing memory and uncertainty to surface more freely. The quiet amplified small sensations. The creak of a bed frame, the shifting of blankets, or distant footsteps outside the barracks became prominent. These sounds reminded prisoners that they were not alone, yet they offered no clear point of tension or release. The mind searched for meaning in stillness and found only time stretching forward without clear end. For many prisoners, this calm triggered an internal conflict. Comfort felt undeserved, almost suspicious. Sleeping in clean conditions while comrades continued to fight or suffer elsewhere created a sense of dislocation. The absence of hardship challenged deeply ingrained beliefs about honor, endurance, and what it meant to be a soldier in captivity. Some prisoners responded by resisting sleep, maintaining habits of vigilance long after they were necessary. They remained half awake, listening for disturbances that never came. Others surrendered to exhaustion, finding that sleep arrived more easily than expected, which in turn brought its own discomfort. Resting well in enemy territory felt like a quiet betrayal of the identity shaped by war. American camp authorities rarely intervened in this process. Their system did not require active psychological pressure. Silence itself performed that function. By removing external stressors, the camp environment forced prisoners to confront internal ones. Thoughts of home, defeat, and uncertainty about the future gained clarity in the absence of immediate danger. As nights passed, prisoners began to recognize that the calm was not temporary. This realization altered their perception of time. Without the markers of battle or hardship, days and nights blurred together, measured only by routine. The silence became a constant companion, shaping how prisoners understood their confinement. Interactions during daylight reflected these changes. Men who struggled with the quiet at night often appeared withdrawn or reflective during the day. Conversations were subdued, focused less on escape or resistance and more on passing time. The camp structure discouraged dramatic action, channeling energy inward instead. By this stage, German POWs understood that American captivity did not seek to overwhelm them through suffering. Instead, it applied pressure through stillness and predictability. Silence, once a threat on the battlefield, had become a tool of control within the camp. The nights, calm and unbroken, taught prisoners that endurance in this environment required adaptation to a form of confinement that offered rest without release. In this quiet, the true weight of captivity settled in, not as fear or pain, but as the steady presence of time and thought. As German prisoners of war adjusted to the rhythm of nights inside American camps, they gradually became aware that the calm they experienced was not accidental, nor was it simply a byproduct of humane treatment. It was the result of a carefully regulated system designed to function smoothly over long periods of time, relying on supervision, documentation, and consistency rather than visible force. Every aspect of life surrounding rest was governed by rules. Bed assignments were fixed, barracks layouts were standardized, and schedules were posted and followed without exception. This structure extended beyond sleep itself, shaping the entire daily cycle in ways that reinforced order. By the time night arrived, prisoners were already aligned with expectations established throughout the day. Supervision within the barracks was deliberately understated. Guards were present, but they did not dominate the space. Their authority was expressed through procedure rather than confrontation. Night checks were conducted quietly, at regular intervals, creating an awareness of oversight without provoking anxiety. The absence of aggressive enforcement made resistance feel unnecessary and, over time, impractical. Medical oversight further reinforced this environment. Regular inspections ensured that prisoners remained physically capable, well-rested, and free from illness that could disrupt routine. Sleep was treated as a component of health management, not as a concession. By maintaining bodies, the system reduced friction and preserved stability, ensuring that the camp operated predictably. This approach reflected broader administrative priorities. American authorities understood that unrest often emerged from exhaustion and uncertainty. By minimizing both, they created conditions in which compliance emerged naturally. Rested prisoners were less volatile, more cooperative, and easier to manage. Control was achieved not through deprivation, but through normalization. For the prisoners, recognizing this dynamic added another layer of discomfort. The system's effectiveness lay in its invisibility. There were no dramatic moments of repression to resist, no singular figure of authority to oppose. Instead, control was embedded in routine itself, making it difficult to distinguish where personal choice ended and compliance began. Over time, prisoners began to regulate themselves. Noise was reduced without prompting. Lights out was anticipated rather than enforced, and order within the barracks was maintained collectively. This internalization of rules marked a significant psychological shift. Authority no longer needed to assert itself directly. It was carried forward by habit. The physical environment reinforced this transformation. Clean sleeping quarters, orderly rows of beds, and consistent lighting patterns communicated stability. These signals shaped behavior subtly, encouraging conformity without explicit instruction. The camp's architecture itself became part of the disciplinary system. This form of control was particularly disorienting for men trained to respond to overt command and visible hierarchy. In the absence of constant pressure, prisoners were left to navigate their own responses to confinement. Adaptation felt less like submission and more like survival within an unchanging framework. As weeks turned into months, the effectiveness of this quiet architecture became evident. The barracks remained calm, nights passed without incident, and the routine continued uninterrupted. Captivity did not escalate or intensify, it endured. For many German POWs, this realization carried a weight heavier than fear, as it suggested that release would come not through resistance, but through time itself. By this stage, sleep was no longer a surprise or a comfort. It was a regulated function within a system that sought to maintain order indefinitely. Through supervision that remained distant and rules that governed quietly, American camps demonstrated a form of control that relied on stability rather than suffering, reshaping how prisoners understood both captivity and power. By the later stages of captivity, German prisoners of war understood that the greatest challenge posed by American prison camps was no longer uncertainty or fear, but time itself. Days and nights followed the same pattern with little variation, and within this repetition, the quiet of the barracks began to carry a deeper psychological weight. Sleep, once a scarce resource during war, became regular and predictable. This consistency restored physical strength, but it also removed the urgency that had defined life on the front lines. Without immediate danger or deprivation to occupy the mind, prisoners became increasingly aware of the slow passage of days. Each night of rest reinforced the reality that captivity was not a temporary disruption, but a prolonged state of waiting. Adaptation occurred gradually. Prisoners learned how to move within the system, anticipating schedules and adjusting behavior to maintain personal stability. These adjustments were rarely discussed openly. They unfolded quietly, shaped by repetition rather than conscious decision. Over time, The camp's routines felt less imposed and more expected, blurring the line between adaptation and acceptance. The quiet nights played a central role in this transformation. Lying awake beneath clean blankets, prisoners reflected on how different their situation was from what they had imagined. Comfort did not erase the sense of loss, but it altered how loss was processed. Instead of reacting to hardship, prisoners confronted absence, distance from home, and the uncertainty of when captivity would end. This shift affected how prisoners related to one another. Conversations became more subdued, focused on passing time rather than planning action. The shared experience of orderly confinement created a subtle bond, not rooted in resistance, but in mutual adjustment. Men measure progress not by achievements, but by weeks completed without incident. American camp administrators rarely needed to intervene during this phase. The system sustained itself through habit. Rested prisoners adhered to routine, minimizing conflict and preserving order. Control no longer required visible enforcement, as the structure of daily life guided behavior naturally. For some prisoners, this realization was deeply unsettling. Adaptation felt uncomfortably close to surrender. Accepting routine and comfort from the enemy conflicted with beliefs formed through years of training and propaganda. Yet resisting adaptation offered no practical alternative. Survival depended on enduring within the system, not opposing it. Time, rather than hardship, became the defining factor of captivity. Nights passed quietly, marked by predictable darkness and steady silence. Each morning brought the same routine, reinforcing the sense that captivity was designed to persist until external events determined its conclusion. As the war progressed elsewhere, prisoners inside American camps experienced conflict indirectly through rumors and limited information. The contrast between distant chaos and local calm heightened the psychological divide. The quiet nights emphasized how separated they were from the war they had known. By the end of this period, German prisoners of war recognized that American captivity tested endurance in an unexpected way. It did not seek to exhaust the body or terrorize the mind. Instead, it relied on time, routine, and quiet to shape behavior and perception. In this environment, sleep became more than rest. It became a symbol of a system that preserved physical well-being while extending confinement indefinitely. The calm of the barracks, repeated night after night, revealed a form of control that operated patiently, leaving its deepest impact not through suffering, but through the steady passage of time. For German prisoners of war held in the United States, captivity unfolded in a way that few had anticipated. Instead of constant punishment or physical deprivation, they encountered a system defined by routine, order, and quiet control. Beds, blankets, and silent nights became symbols of a form of confinement that preserved the body while steadily reshaping the mind. The absence of hardship did not erase the reality of imprisonment. Instead, it removed familiar points of resistance, forcing prisoners to confront captivity through time rather than suffering. Regular sleep restored strength, but it also extended awareness, making each day and night part of an unchanging cycle governed by rules beyond individual influence. American prison camps demonstrated that control did not always require force. Through structure, supervision, and predictability, authority was maintained quietly. Prisoners adapted not because they were broken, but because the system functioned steadily, encouraging compliance through normalcy rather than fear. For many, this experience left lasting questions. Comfort provided by an enemy challenged deeply held beliefs about honor, endurance, and what captivity was meant to be. The calm nights, repeated without interruption, became a reminder that power could operate patiently, shaping behavior without visible violence. When the war eventually ended and prisoners returned home, memories of captivity were not defined solely by fences or guards, but by silence, routine, and the unsettling realization that imprisonment in America had tested them in ways they had never prepared for. In the end, German prisoners of war did not remember American camps for cruelty alone, but for a quieter form of control, one that revealed how time, order, and calm could weigh just as heavily as hardship. For more untold World War II stories like this, subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault and continue the journey with us.